I am so grateful that even when we can't see it, God is working. Amen? Because we wouldn't show up. We wouldn't have the courage to walk through the door when the conversation is about hard things. Sometimes things experienced in our childhood, sometimes things that have happened one time, sometimes things that are repeated events in our lives. But I know, like you, I carry a load. And tonight I want to share how we can begin to unpack that load in a way that is healthy and healing, and all with Jesus as our foundation. And so I will just be upfront and tell you I'm not a trauma expert. I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't have all kinds of letters behind my name. I haven't written books. I'm just an ordinary girl who loves life, and I love living for Jesus. And I'm so grateful for those that he puts in my path every day that I get to walk with and talk with. And so, actually what I am is a licensed social worker, and most of my career I have worked in foster care and adoption. And the last 4 years I have moved into the schools, and I am passionate about my role in working with children. So I have seen trauma. I have walked with those. I have experienced trauma, and I have healed from trauma. And I'm so grateful that I have had a God that has been with me in the beginning. He's never left me in the middle, and I know that I have hope for my future while I carry this load. One of the most pivotal things that I have learned is that I am not alone. In my personal journey, in my professional journey, I have learned that I'm not alone. Actually, all of us have been exposed to stress, to trauma, and events that have really just rocked our reality. I know that this is what I do with my kids at school. Raise your hand if you've ever felt overwhelmed. And then the whole class raises their hand. And then I say, that's stress, right? When we feel overwhelmed, when we feel like there's more here than I can handle. My world has been rocked. I wasn't planning on this. I didn't expect this. That's stress. But when that stress moves to a place of lasting adverse effect that impacts our functioning and our well-being, now we've moved to a place of trauma. And so I would suggest that I have seen and experienced trauma. And I would suggest that each of you has seen and experienced trauma. I just want to take a little time this evening talking about the impact that stress and trauma can have on our mental health. It for sure affects our physical, our social, our emotional, and our spiritual health. But I want to suggest what the Bible has to say about it, and then I want to cross it with what we have learned through science and through research. Really just in the last 15 to 20 years, a lot of new information has come about the healing that can come from really hard, adverse, negative, emotionally tough situations that we feel we'll be stuck in forever. I used to reject the idea that everyone experienced trauma. Oh no, that's just big T trauma. I haven't had the harsh reality of a memory that will stick and hang with me forever. But as I do this journey, as I walk with my backpack, as I experience life and walk alongside of those, I know that actually all of us carry a backpack. It's an invisible one. Some of you have peeked inside. Others of you don't dare. Some have delved in and took out those rocks and really got to work on exposing the truth and on seeking healing. No matter where you are tonight, I'm grateful that you're here. I know it's hard to walk through the door into a night that is entitled Trauma and Triggers. Such a difficult conversation. I'm confident that trauma has shaped each human being because we live in a traumatically broken world. And so this shouldn't be a surprise, right? God's word states very clearly that in this world we're going to have trouble. And I just for fun looked up a few different versions of this. Matthew 16:33 says, "Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I've overcome the world." And then from the NIV, "In this world you will have trouble." That's another way to say it. "But take heart, I have overcome the world." "You will have suffering in this world. Be courageous, I have conquered the world." And then from the Message, "In this godless world you'll continue to experience difficulties, but take heart, I have conquered the world." So no matter how we want to call it, trials, sorrows, trouble, difficulty, suffering, rocks that we carry around, that's the bad news, right? God created us good, but when we entered into this world, we're surrounded by trials, sorrows, troubles. And so we shouldn't be surprised, yet it can rock our world so much that it rocks our mental health as well. Stress and trauma have affected the way we see ourselves and relate in our world today. I want to take a peek inside. See if you can relate to any of these rocks. We start with a big one: abuse and neglect. Family conflict, sin, pressure, absent parents, chronic lying, feeling of tired and exhaustion, divorce, job loss, foster care, comparison, worry, abortion. Just a rock of emptiness. Sometimes we can't put a name on it yet, but we just feel this heavy load. Gossip, tragic accident, narcissism, self-centeredness, focused on self, overwhelmed by school, broken relationships, competition, those are a lot of rocks. I wonder, what are you carrying in your backpack? Invisible to others, but probably real prevalent to you. I wonder how it is affecting you. So we'll focus tonight about trauma, because trauma actually has the power to adversely affect the way that we function in this world today. In our jobs, in our relationships, the way we see ourselves, the way we relate to those in our past or present, the way that we will relate and have relationship into the future. And so I want to just start with a definition of trauma, and this is what I see. Trauma results from the exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and/or spiritual well-being. So I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I'm wondering if I did and asked who here thinks that they have experienced trauma. I would say that maybe half of you, right, would raise your hand. I'm hoping that by the time we reach the end of this, you might have a little clearer glimpse into what trauma is and how it impacts. And so revisiting this definition, it's an exposure to an incident or a series of events. So trauma can be acute, meaning that it could be a one-time event that has happened one time in your life, and it rocked your world enough that you fell apart, physically, emotionally, spiritually walked away, emotionally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, socially, affected your relationships in a way that you were not able to function using your capability, and your well-being in some way impacted the way that you did life. Now, most of the time, I think that we all would agree that we all have experienced things like that. But the trauma part of it, the difference between being overwhelmed and being stressed out and feeling like you can't go another day and you can't wake up in the morning, so different than mental health, the trauma would be that this is going to affect you day to day to day to day. And it might be a week, and you will find healing in your trauma. It might be a month, and you will find some healing in trauma. It could be years. It could be a lifetime. What is important to understand is that trauma knows no boundaries. No one is exempt. All are susceptible, yet this is a very common experience for human beings. So, we talked about acute. The chronic would be a repeated or prolonged exposure. This might be growing up in a family where one of the family members needed continual hospitalization due to cancer treatment, something like that. And so you grew up with a sibling in that situation. Even though it didn't necessarily affect your life, it certainly did affect your family experience and the way that you interacted in the community because of something that another that you were in relationship was experiencing. And then there's the complex trauma. This might be, this is the slide with those rocks at the top, because I feel like this is often what happens in our life. And when I have 8th grade middle school girls come into my office and they say, "Mrs. Stahl, I just can't do another day," I say, let's break it down. Let's talk about what are you feeling, what are you experiencing, and it's this. It's this layering of there are things out of my control that I cannot take care of. Who are my parents? What are the decisions they're making? Where do I live? What is my ethnicity? What's going to be prepared for me for dinner tonight? A lot of things that they can't control on top of things that they can control. What sports activities am I going to be a part of? What friends will I hang out with? How will I use social media? What movies am I watching? And I get a stack of books, and I begin stacking it up. And I say, first, let's talk about what can't you control about this situation that you're dealing with right at this minute. So I ask you to do the same. While we're talking, think about what is outside of your control. And then step into what can you control. What thoughts or feelings or behaviors or decisions or choices can you control that's contributing? And then I usually did this in the last couple of years. I threw a big old thick, fat, wide book down and I said, and this is COVID-19. Everything in life was rocked because of a pandemic that none of us had known about, experienced, and it changed. If you felt like you hadn't experienced trauma, I would say that the pandemic rocked us all, right? It changed the way that we saw ourselves, saw the world, the way that we functioned. And now, but the world didn't stop. Our books kept piling up. And now we have conflict at home. Dad lost a job. You still have to go to volleyball practice. They're expecting you to still present your science fair project, and it piles. And I say, what's going to happen to that pile of books? And they're almost going like this, "Mrs., don't let it fall." If we don't take care of things that we can control, it's going to topple to the ground. And then the difference between stress and trauma is, do we have the ability, do we have the coping skills? Do we have strategies? Do we have the support system? Do we have a mental health specialist, a pastor, a counselor that we can reach out to help us pick up those pieces and put them back neatly on the stack, right? Life is never neat. We know that. But the difference between stress and coping, complex stress, complex trauma, is, can you get back to a place of okay? Or do you operate in a hyper-vigilant, hyper-driven, always looking, waiting for the next worst thing to happen? Big T trauma, there's a slide here that just gives a huge variety of different things, and this is not exhaustive at all. But big T trauma might be trauma that everyone experiences and would agree, now that was traumatic, that adversely affected my emotion, my ability to function, maybe a day, maybe a week, maybe a month, maybe long term. If we think about 9/11, wait, are you old enough to think about 9/11? Okay. 9/11, the pandemic, hurricanes, earthquakes that rock a community and maybe took a home and you no longer can go back to that home, right? If you have trouble getting back to a place of physical, social, emotional, mental well-being, that's trauma. Big T trauma is something that everyone understands why this event would have rocked you and likely rocked them as well. The unspoken, is this really trauma? Because it sure seems to have hit me hard, but my neighbor or my best friend or my spouse doesn't seem impacted at all. Little T trauma are often experienced at a personal level, something that just you experience. Maybe no one else knows. Maybe you've never shared it with a soul. It might be something that's just happened within your family. And in our culture, in our community, sometimes we're hush-hush, keep it behind. Let's not let anybody know the hard that has happened in our life. And we just keep it what seems like a little T trauma, but in our brains it's a big T. These are life events that hit people differently. So we wouldn't expect the same type of reaction from different people. Loss of a pet, loss of a job, moving to a new home, moving across the country, rejected by a friend group, a miscarriage, something that maybe no one knows about. Typical life events that hit people differently. And there's a myriad of other things here. I'm guessing that each one of you could at least find one thing on that list that has affected you. Many of us, probably many more. Again, the difference is, has it rocked your world in a way that you have lost the ability to function to the full design and capability that God has intended you to live at? Have you noticed that your well-being, socially, you don't want to leave the house, mentally, self-esteem, I'm no good, I could never contribute here, why my word doesn't matter, emotionally, feeling down, feeling dark, feeling depressed, feeling anxious, and physically, sometimes there have been traumatic events that affect you physically, either psychosomatically, where you're having stomach aches and headaches, and that's keeping you from going to work or keeping you from going to the family birthday party, but also could be you lost a leg, or you were in a car accident, hit by a train, have traumatic head injury. Sometimes the traumas create physical responses that affect your well-being. Here's the thing, trauma rewires our brain. And I told you I'm not a neuroscientist, but it certainly helps me to understand this, and I'm hoping it does you a little bit too. Trauma leaves an imprint because of the way that the human brain is wired. One of our most basic needs is a sense of safety. We are programmed to remember things that will be useful for our survival and help us to remain safe in the future. So when something very bad or painful or scary happens, our brain jumps to wanting to keep us safe, to make sure it never happens again and you don't have to repeat that event again. When we don't have the skills to deal or to cope or to resolve, this imprint becomes a memory. And that memory becomes a thought pattern, and that thought pattern begins to adversely affect our functioning. And so we don't need to get too scientific here, but these pathways in your brain stick like glue. And when they have an event that has rocked our world, that has tripped us out, that has made us adversely respond, the brain remembers that. And then it digs grooves, and then it's like a running track. And these neurotransmitters that are all over our brain sending messages here, there, and everywhere remember the pain. And if we don't unleash it, if we don't expose it or uncover it, that's what can begin to affect our mental health. Because the pathways in our brains are grooving, telling us we're not safe, then sometimes lifelong insecurities can take root. This next slide shows a very simplified picture of the brain, and I think that this is helps us to understand that there's an upstairs brain and there's a downstairs brain. Like I said, very simple. But it's the control center, it's the computer that helps us stay alive. We need our brain, right? We need to stay alive. It's about survival. And then it helps us to make sense and respond to the world around us. And so the downstairs part of your brain, this is the first part of the brain that is developed after the brainstem, and it is the feeler. It's survival, it's safety, it's emotion, and it's sensory, it's senses. It helps to keep those things regulated. We need that part of the brain. God created feelings. He created us to respond, but then he gave us this top part, the upstairs part of our brain that says, I'm going to give you ways to reason, to make sense of things, to problem solve, to make good decisions. We need both parts. We need them to be speaking to each other. Messages are sent to the brain all day long. 99% of the time, our amygdala, which is this middle section, I'm going to use my hand as an example here. The amygdala, which is in the middle here, part of the lower brain, receives that message and says, am I safe? And depending on how that amygdala borrows then from the hippocampus, which is where our memories are stored, it's going to respond. It demands a response. Okay? So if this is like our brain here, let me back up. So we take in the world through our senses. Those senses send messages to our brain and demand a response. Our innate desire is to feel safe and to feel secure. When those senses tell us we're safe, our upstairs brain kicks in. Logic, problem solving, reasoning, rational thinking. So here's the example. A boiling pot of water on the stove. We grab for it, we miss the handle, we touch the pot, and immediately we pull our hand back. That's a really fast reaction for how that amygdala in the middle, down at the bottom, senses and says, upstairs brain, I need you, please tell me what to do. Well, the common solution is to pull that hand back and kind of comes and covers and protects that feeling and says, I've got you, and kind of covers back up, and now we're back into a calm state. But when those senses tell us we're not safe, then we flip our lid. And it's kind of, that's kind of a, oh, she flipped out again, right? That's kind of like if we think about our brain flipping the lid. This would be if I reached out to grab that pot, my brain told my amygdala said, wow, that really hurt. And I'm just going to focus on that hurt. Mom, that hurt. I don't know what to do. That hurt. I don't know what. And we're flipping our lid, and we don't have the skills to connect to that upstairs brain to come and say, well, here's how we problem solve that. Let me bring you back to a calm state. Then we stay in a flipped out or a hypervigilant or a reactive or hypersensitive state. And this is what trauma does. Trauma affects that amygdala in a way that sometimes keeps our brain flipped out, either hypervigilant or we're pulling back, and we're not going there. We're dismissing, we're excusing, we're not going to go to those hard places. So a lot of times the trauma or the memories of trauma flip our lid and allow the emotions and feelings to take over. Our need for safety and survival overrides any ability there may be to think rationally or make well thought out decisions. So our emotional responses do the thinking, and then they begin to form these thought patterns. And then there's triggers. So remembering that trauma adversely affects your functioning for a period of time, it has impacted your physical, mental, emotional, spiritual well-being in some way for a period of time. Many people work through and heal from the trauma that they've experienced in their life. But when you are triggered, when that amygdala is exposed to the reminder, the sight, the sound, help me out with the other senses, the sight, the sound, the smell, the touch, right? Those experiences brings you right back, and you flip, and you're right back in that hypervigilant, looking around what's going to happen badly again. And when you live in that state, I think that's what you talked about last week, is the anxiety, right? Anxiety is one of the responses to a flipped lid. Depression or pulling back, not feeling like you have the capacity, the energy, the ability to do life can be another response. Mental illness would be another response. Triggers don't necessarily have to be negative, of course. So I'm going to pose this question. Talk to your neighbor. Who are you going to go see this weekend? The Backstreet Boys, Ken Griffey Jr., or Julia Roberts? Are these people in your life as teenagers? I was trying to be like 90s. I'm a little bit before the 90s, but talk to your neighbor. Who would you go see? The Backstreet Boys, Ken Griffey Jr., or Julia Roberts? And go ahead, tell your neighbor what movie you would choose to see with Julia Roberts. All right, I see that hopefully sparked a little bit of oh yes, that's right. Haven't heard of Ken Griffey for a while, right? How about this? I'm wondering if you remember Silly Bands, Pogs, Webkins, or Beanie Babies. Tell your neighbor what was your trend of choice. All right, lots to talk about. You see, your hippocampus has done an excellent job of storing memories, and it's delightful when they're positive, uplifting, happy ones. But we know that sometimes triggers also bring up memories that are not. Triggers can suddenly spark memories that we thought we had worked through, we thought we were past, we thought that we had healed from. Sometimes triggers are really obvious. I'll give this example. If you were 5 years old and were bit by a dog, I bet when you hear a barking dog, you go right back to that moment of when you were running for your life because the dog came after you, and I bet you don't love dogs to this day. How about getting that filling, having a cavity as a kid, sitting under that drill with those awful sounds around you? I bet you don't volunteer to sign up for those preventative dental checks, right? Because it flips your lid, it brings you back, it triggers the memory of something that was difficult or painful. And while you have come to a place of functioning and strong well-being, it still triggers a response. And then does your brain stay flipped? Or do you have the capacity, the problem solving, the decision making, the strategies to come back to a place of calm? Other triggers are less clear. I'm wondering if you've ever experienced this. You hear a song on the radio and you're like, this sounds vaguely familiar. I'm wondering why I have this pit in my stomach and my heart feels sad. And then you remember, oh yeah, it was from the high school breakup. That was our song, right? Or maybe on a more serious note, you smell a certain cologne, and it takes you right back to a situation where you're like, get me out of there. I was not safe. I was violated. I was taken advantage of. That was not a healthy, good environment for me, and I need to get out. Now, you maybe wouldn't walk along Walmart's rows and pick out the cologne and have that trigger, but boy, when that sense of smell triggers, and it could be, there are a million different things that can trigger our sight, our sound, smells, and thoughts. Triggers can flip our lids when we least expect it. We feel like we're right back in the trauma. It's often unpleasant, and it catches us off guard. We need to have coping skills that connect our upstairs brain that will employ the problem-solving, rational thinking, and solid decision-making. So now we need to get practical. You know, when I think about myself, I first think about myself as a follower of Jesus. And then I think about myself as a wife and a mom and a friend and a daughter and then I get to oh yeah, that's right. I get to walk with people as a therapist, as a social worker. I don't see myself as an expert. So the things that come to my mind first are, what does God's word say about this? How can I live my life in ways that God expects me to deal from hardship? And so God's word actually provides some pretty solid instruction on how to handle suffering. In addition, we find in the Old and New Testament that there are people that God has called to speak truth, to admonish, to encourage, to pull people out of pits, right? And so here is a list of biblical tips for healing. And I just put some of the biblical references there in case you thought I was making them up. But the Bible tells us to share your burdens. Don't keep them hidden under a bushel. Don't keep them trapped on the inside. Share your burdens. Maybe it's to the Lord. Maybe it's to one friend. Maybe it's to your journal. Maybe it will be to a therapist. Maybe it's to your spouse one day. But share your burdens, because we know that when they're exposed to the light, then darkness has no place. Build community. God does not intend for us to do this life alone. And so surround yourself, right, with people who are like-minded, that you can feel safe with, that you feel like you can trust, build rapport with, and that are going to love you no matter what you bring. No matter how many rocks you unload on them, they're going to say, I'm all in. I'm here with you. Find community. The Bible encourages it. Breath prayers. I didn't give any verses here because I feel like there would be most verses, but these would be things like, fill me, Spirit. I need you, Jesus. Come close. Don't leave me now. These are verses all throughout the Bible where God is giving us promises, and sometimes as a believer, I just need to say a breath prayer. I'm not going to stand up and pray in front of everyone, or I'm entering into a challenging situation, and sometimes a tip for taking one step forward, I should have said this long ago. Healing is a journey, and you're not going to get from the beginning to the end like this. It's going to be this much. It's going to be one step forward. And so one step forward might be breath prayers for you. No one else needs to know but you. It's just you and God. Help me through this. Fill me with your Spirit. Give me courage, right? And then ironically, the others are really focused on positive, optimistic, happy, healthy things, even though when we're in this state, we often feel the opposite. Expressing gratitude. Give thanks to the Lord. His love endures forever. Rejoice in all circumstances. The Lord is good. Give thanks. And then we're going to encourage others. Sometimes when we take the focus off ourselves and encourage others, spur one another on in love. Encourage the disheartened. God sees you. He knows you. He knows what you've got. But his word still says encourage others. Because the power in just sharing a word with one other person in his spirit-filled way lightens your load, lightens your heart. And then this one I've happened to pick up from showing up at church the last couple of Sundays, right? Practice Sabbath. Rest is necessary. Rest is a commandment. Rest is for your good and his glory. So as I have my list of items here, I thought, okay, that's really nice. Those are biblical. Do they seem a little fluffy? Like that doesn't really take us to the hardcore, how do we begin healing? So I thought I better pull up, go to my go-to strategies, my go-to therapeutic practices when I'm working with kids. And plus, there might be people here tonight who are struggling with it. Who is God? Can I rely on his word? Can I trust it? And so I'll add in a little science, and here's the really cool thing. Science suggests that the brain can heal itself. Now we know, right, the cliche, well, God can heal anything. Give your burden to God, God will heal it. Science actually says the same. The brain can heal itself from damage that is caused by the help of something called neuroplasticity. This allows the brain to create new pathways. So those grooves, those pathways that were ingrained with the trauma, with the negative thought pattern, with I can't do this on my own, I can't take another step, I can't get up for work, how will I ever forgive that person who caused me so much pain? The brain can actually create new pathways and strengthen existing ones. Scientifically or therapeutically, how would one go about healing? And here was the amazing thing where God showed up as I was preparing. The strategies are almost exactly the same to what God lays out for us in his word. The practices and strategies that mental health practitioners, therapists around the world, social workers, sociologists, research shows would suggest that these are the top 5 or 6 ways that if you enter into a therapeutic relationship, these are the things that they would work on. Name it to tame it. That's one of my favorite ones with the kids. You got to say it out loud. You have to say, Mrs. Stahl, today my tummy hurts and I can't take this test. You have to say, I'm really angry that he pushed me on the playground. Now clearly, translate this to your own life. I'm really upset that the boss wrote me up for being late. Or, I'm not sure I can handle my sister's complaining one more day. Or whenever I see that ad on TV, it takes me right back to where I was in a pit, in a hard place. You need to name it in order to tame it. Otherwise, we leave that sense, that feeling, that survival mode exposed, and we don't have the ability to tame it, to bring it down to a place of just calm and regulation. Build community. Ironically or not, this is one of the things that a therapist would tell someone too. Who's your support system? Who do you have on your team? Identify a captain. Who are you going to go to when the going gets tough? Who's your go-to? And then who are the assistants? Who are the players? Who else is in your circle? Could be 2 people. It might be 22 people. But make sure that you are building community and connecting with others. Maybe it's online. Maybe it's at your workplace. Maybe it's in your family. Maybe it's at church. But be sure that you are in community with 1 or 2 other people who can hold you accountable, build you up, but also that you can, when we get to the encourage and gratitude part here, be a part of their team. And then the weirdest thing are these breathing exercises. I didn't believe it for a very long time. Still sometimes I'm like, really? Is taking deep breaths and blowing out birthday candles and this is one of my favorites that I do with the kids, is that, okay, kids, we're going to just take a deep breath. We're going to calm down. So I want you to pretend that you're taking a hot plate of cookies out of the oven and bring it up close to your nose, and you're going to breathe in. And now they're so hot, before you can take a bite, you have to blow out. And before you know it, they're breathing. And the crazy from indoor recess in the rainy weather has calmed. And so just adult breathing, right, is a God-given, innate way that he says it's one of the best ways to bring you from here to here. Because when you give your brain space, just simply by breathing through, all of a sudden, rationalize, problem solve, decision make, and you're back to a state of a little more calm. Gratitude journal. So there's the real thing that when you say thank you, when you write down a list of things that, wow, I saw God here today, or I felt this today. When you express your gratitude, when you show thankfulness, it actually releases this dopamine in your brain, this happy chemical that helps you to feel a little lighter. And if you don't believe me, just try it. I'm horrible at journaling, but a gratitude journal seems so simple, but it's what the experts are telling their clients for $100 and something an hour, that this is one of the best ways that you can bring that prefrontal cortex down to protect that fight or flight, that survival instinct. And then encouraging others, we're going to shift our thought patterns. I think that you probably talk about that with anxiety, but that your brain is wired, right, to think and believe a certain thing that oftentimes is not true. And so when you shift to the truth, this is when you're going to go to your captain, you're going to get to your text group, you're going to talk to your boss, and they're going to change the narrative so that you can believe the truth about who you are. You are not your trauma. You are not your hardship. You are not stuck in that place. Actually, God has called you to more. God has called you to shift to a place to believe you are who he says you are. And sometimes that message comes through the encouragement of others. And then practice Sabbath. Okay, true thing too, right? When you go to the doctor and they say the best thing, exercise and sleep. And I say, I wish I hadn't come because I love rest, but the exercise part, and how much is too much rest. But here, resting, when you are resting your body and your mind and your brain, there's a lot of healing that goes on. A lot of healing. So what's in your backpack? Sometimes we're tempted to ask if God is good, to question how God could allow painful experiences, hardships, a path that's so dramatically different than what you had planned. So from Bible teacher Jen Wilkin, I love her studies, she says, instead of asking if God is good, know that he is and ask him to show you his goodness in the midst of your circumstances. Stand on this truth. So isn't this just like God? What neuroscience has discovered, God knew all along. So what's in your backpack? Can you name your rocks? Or are some of them nameless? For some, it's an easy answer. You can name a life-changing trauma that has adversely impacted the way that you do life. For others, there isn't a clear answer, but rather a feeling of just heaviness or burden, not able to quite get to the root of it, can't quite put a name on it. And yet others, we've packed it away and sealed it tight, believing it's better just left alone and rather just continue to carry the burden without peeking inside. Jesus wants to take your burdens. He wants to take your stress, your hardship, your pain, your struggle, your suffering, your trauma, your rocks. He says in his word, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." He says, "Cast all of your cares on me because I care for you." Your Creator knew before you were born what your journey looked like. And God doesn't make mistakes. He created you good. He created you with a purpose. He has a powerful plan for you. He knew that you were coming into a world with all of the things. How does a good God allow such things? I promise you, look for his goodness and he will show. It will not be easy. To expose truth, to reveal to the light what has been dark, will be exhausting, will be sometimes painful, but so much life comes from that. God says you're good. You have purpose, you have value, there are plans to prosper you. I won't leave you alone in this. Actually, my plans are good. And then he says, will you take these rocks, take this trauma, take the family conflict, take the job loss, take the chronic lying, the worry, the pressure, it's just never enough. Take the family conflict, that's out of your control, you never asked for it. And just begin laying them down. Name your rocks, expose them to the light. The abortion that no one knows about, that's heavy, it's hard to carry. You don't need to carry it anymore. Self-centered, exhaustion, emptiness, divorce, tragic accident, comparison, abuse, neglect, a feeling of abandonment, the feeling of rejection, gossip that seems to have a tight hold on your tongue. Will you take it to Jesus? He says, I want your rocks. I knew they'd be there, but now I want you to give them up. It sounds so easy. But God, would you surround me in community? Would you find ways that I can encourage others? Would I just look around and see the goodness? God, when I need you, will I talk to you? Will I not put you out? And will I just leave my rocks there at the foot of the cross just to take one tiny step toward healing? And that's my prayer for you tonight. That in the midst of trauma, heartache, hardship, doesn't go away like that. But you have a God, and you have a community, you have a church family who has open arms to say, just start, just one small thing. Just find one way to begin to release it. Because I have created you for good. I've created you for a calm state, for full functioning. I want you to be the very best you can be. And the way that you do that is you give it over. You give it to me. So simplistic. But when we get back to those basics, it helps us to really rest, find rest in him. And so I didn't focus tonight a lot on all the different resources and places you can go. And I encourage, I advocate that part of your team in working toward healing would be that someone on your team is a professional that can help you in the journey of exposing or talking about or working through that pain that's got a hold on your heart. But I think it starts with Jesus. And it starts with the God who loves you so much that gave you his son and said, let me put it on the cross. My son Jesus will take those rocks. Please don't carry them anymore because it's quite a load. But boy, when I let go, hey, I can do life, right? I have the ability to be all my Maker created me to be, hand in hand with Jesus. So that's what I have for tonight. And